let's get started. So for today, we've got two learning objectives. The first is learning how to navigate the different types of fundraising and making decisions about that. And the second is how to write grant applications that are really good and that will hopefully get you funded in the future, right? So yeah, let's just get cracking on the first one, which is what types of fundraising really are there? So I'm just gonna open this up to all of you. Like, what types of fundraising do you think there are? Have you experimented with any of them? Are there any that work really well? Any that work not as well? Yeah, I'll just feel free to raise your hand or to shout out if you've got anything to add here. It'd be really cool. Well, okay. It's not that complicated actually. Like, there's like a million of them, right? You've probably used quite a few of these in the past. There's fundraising through events, like a fundraising event, online donation platforms, grants, marketing through emails, reaching out to major donors. There's a million of them. These don't even cover all of them. And I'm curious to know, just so we can tailor the session to that as well, if any of these particularly appeal to you, or like I said earlier, have you experimented with any of them? Any fundraising type that you're using that's maybe missing from here that you think should have been included? Just shout out if you've got any thoughts on that really quick.
Maybe governmental funding is an interesting one. That's often, not talked about as much, especially like early stage organizations. But I think if you really want to go for, really large scale governmental funding is something where you can have a sustained large amount of money coming in. It is obviously quite hard to get access to that kind of funding, but as you go into a later stage, it's an interesting route that sometimes nonprofits don't look at.
Yeah, it seems like a high risk, high reward funding opportunities, because it's hard to convince the government to be funding animal advocacy work. But if they do agree, that'd be really cool. I see a hand raised. Is it Daniel, if I'm pronouncing that right?
Yeah, good morning. Yes, so I'm curious if others here have a similar model to us. We're a Tanzanian-based organization, but now myself and Liam, who's also here, we have been invited over the past couple of years. We start a U.S. board to support the Tanzanian organization so that we can get U.S.-based grants and funding and donors and that sort of thing. So we're kind of that partner nonprofit, and I don't know if others have similar models here.
Yeah, I'd be keen to see if anyone has a response to that. But from what I understand, there are quite a few organizations across Africa looking to get eligibility as charities in the US to getting a board, simply because that does allow them to get more funding opportunities. I see another hand raised. Do you want to speak up? Could you tell me how to pronounce your name as well, please?
Yes, hi, my name is Baden. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to echo what Danielle was saying there. We are exploring a similar strategy with our ties in the UK, to be honest, and setting up a UK-based organization where we'll have easier access to those funds to bring them into Africa to support ourselves and then organizations like ourselves in the country as well. So we are exploring that. We are very, very well right at the beginning of that journey, though. So yeah, just wanted to echo what you were saying.
Yeah, that's really cool, actually, and it actually leads perfectly into the next point, which is how do you decide what opportunities to pursue? For example, how did you come to the decision to make that step into the UK? I just want to again ask everyone else, how do you decide, for example, whether to pursue fundraising through events or fundraising through grant applications? And after deciding which type to pursue, how do you decide, for example, which event to organize or which grant applications to apply for? So yeah, do you guys have any thoughts on that so far? Is that hand still raised, or is it a new hand?
No, I was raising it, and it's a new one. Yeah, so from my perspective, I'm quite new into this industry and to fundraising. in general. So, you know, we've been racking our brains, and you know, I've worked in corporate where we've done similar initiatives, and you know, it's not beyond me to think up things. But as an organization, and coming, I'm from Grayson Farm Animal Sanctuary, for anybody that was wondering, and for us to organize things, yeah, it's quite a, at the moment, it's a little bit of, as you just said, where we put our resources, and we're trying a little bit of everything, and I feel like that may be detracting from how well we could be doing at one particular type of fundraising. For instance, you know, like, you know, we're going to events, we're going to markets, we're setting up a presence there, we're standing there, we're engaging with people about what we do, who we are. We've got some merchandise that we've paid for and we're selling, and you know, it's not selling like hotcakes, but we're making a little bit here and there on it. We're selling merch for partners who give us a percentage of their sold goods as well. So we're doing all the hard labor and hard yards on the ground, and then the same breath, you know, coming back after those functions and then sitting behind a computer and going, okay, cool, I'm looking for grants. So with the grant perspective, because I'm new in this side of the world, I've just literally been Googling and going down many rabbit holes and clicking on many buttons, and found some really helpful articles that have given me some good leads. But in that respect, yeah, I haven't myself personally applied for a grant before. So, you know, I've seen some of the questions, I've looked through some of the forms, some of it's very extensive, some of it not so much. So I see that the different organizations obviously are looking for different things from us before they can determine whether to proceed or not. So yeah, I'm coming here to just kind of learn from you guys who've been doing it for a while, where I should be focusing my energy so that we can, you know, start to see a lot more traction.
Yeah, so it's really cool that you've got a lot of different things that you're looking at, right? The cool thing is that there's a lot of things to consider and things like that. I'll share with you how AAA also deals with like a lot of different areas that we could be pursuing, and we've got a certain decision-making framework that I'll share with you guys on how we decide which opportunity we should pursue. So there's quite a few things to consider, right? But the two main ones are a cost-benefit analysis and expected value calculations. So let's get cracking into the first one, which is the cost-benefit analysis, right? So it's really simple. What's the cost of applying for a particular opportunity, or you know, investing in a certain area, for example, selling merchandise? So what do you guys think? What do you think the cost could be? Well, it's like basically it's time and labor, right? How much time does it take and how much energy will it take? And in the case of grant application, for example, this cost is really high if the application form is really long, if it's detailed, if it's something you haven't done before, right? But it could be pretty low if the application form is really short, or if you filled a similar application recently, right? This is about grants, but it can be applied to other things, right? Like if the cost is high, sometimes the cost can be high, sometimes the cost can be low, right? That's one area of it. The second area is what is the benefit of applying for a particular opportunity? And here we assess this through expected value calculations. I'll just talk about that really quick, but obviously the benefit for applying for a particular opportunity is the money, right? And sometimes visibility and feedback. But the crucial point that I want to emphasize is that sometimes even if the benefit or the expected value is low, it might still be worth applying if the cost is even lower. For example, we recently applied for a grant, which we don't think we're necessarily going to get, but the cost of applying was also really low. It was a pretty short application form, so we just went through it, right? So that's something to look at. I'll just get cracking into what an expected value calculation is. But I'll just ask anyone on this call right now, you know what expected value calculations are, if you've used them before, and if so, how that's been. Cool. So it's actually not too complicated. It's the probability of an opportunity being successful multiplied by the monetary value of successful. That sounds like a handful, I know, but it's really not that hard, right? It can be best expressed like this matrix. We've got 4 opportunities here, okay? and they're divided by the probability of your success and the value if you are successful. So for example, high value if successful and low probability of success would be a large grant with a broad scope, right? So it might fund you, it might not, there's low probability, but it has no upper limit on funding, right? Yeah, can you see the screen now?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. We're on the matrix, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, really sorry about that. We'll share the slides with you so you can take a look at everything else that I was sharing earlier. But yeah, so of these 4 opportunities that you can see on the screen right now, which do you think would be the one that you think, I should definitely apply for that? Yeah, any thoughts on that real quick? So it'll probably be this one on the top right, because it's specifically interested in farm animal advocacy in Africa and has no upper limit in funding. So you can apply and there's a high probability that you will get the grant. And if you do get the grant, you're going to get a lot of money, right? So it seems like that's a golden zone. And of course, in practice, it's hard to get because there's no grant yet, at least, that's focused exclusively on farm animal advocacy in Africa and that has unlimited funding. But on a practical level, you can think of this like the EA Animal Welfare Fund, animal charity evaluators, so grants like that, that you know that there's a high probability that you might get them, and there is sufficient benefit if you do get them. And our point essentially is that the benefit of applying for a particular opportunity would be assessed through calculations like these. There's a few other things to consider as well. The first is the fit and scope, which feeds into your probability of success. So you're probably not going to get funding from a grant that's focused on, say, poverty reduction, right? You might have some chance of getting funding from grants that are focused on environmental and climate change. And then you have the most chance of getting money from a grant that's on animal focused, specifically in Africa as well, right? So one good rule of thumb is to always read their scopes to find out what exactly they're funding and whether or not what you're doing aligns with that. The second one is timing. This also feeds into the probability of getting funding, right? So by timing, we mean, should you apply very early on in your intervention or later on? Because if you apply early on, you might not necessarily have the evidence that your intervention is going to work. But if you do it a bit later, then you'll have proof of concept and you can show them that, we've done this before. So there's more reason that you should fund us because there's clear proof of concept. So yeah, that's something to maybe consider because if you wait, you might have a high probability of success. The third is deadlines, right? If there's 2 opportunities, one's in a week and one's in a month, all else equal, probably pursue the one in a week. And yeah, who takes responsibility for this? And this is really hard in small organizations, especially. But it might be worth clearly fleshing out who is it that's responsible for proactively identifying opportunities and assessing whether or not they should be pursued. And after the workshop, we do encourage you to share with us your strategies in terms of all of these things, and we can give you a bit of feedback on that. Lastly, and quite crucially, actually, there's trade-offs. So some funders might want you to focus on things that are outside your strategic focus and outside your values. Sorry. For example, with us, we sometimes have to contend with balancing our strategic priority, which is impact, with that of potential funders which might have other priorities, right? So that's really something to balance, but generally you should try to stick to your values, of course. So this leads to the next point, which is about where do you even find these opportunities? So I'll ask you guys really quick. So where have you found opportunities so far? How's that been?
I think for us, it's been very slow and steady of word of mouth recommendations, just kind of conversation, as opposed to doing, like, I don't think from our board, at least we've done broad searches. I think it's been much more word of mouth and recommendations so far.
Yeah, that seems like something that's low, not as high effort, right, as taking the time out to formally apply for a grant. It's more like, getting people to do that. So I guess that feeds into the cost benefit analysis. So there's quite a few places in general that you can find opportunities. And in terms of grant applications, AAA has a database on our website, and that's reasonably comprehensive in terms of existing international grants, because we've gone through it quite a few times, right? So we highly recommend that you take a look over there if you're looking for grants to apply for. You can even check if you'd be eligible for them in terms of being a US 501c, for example. The second is conferences and networking events. And I feel like this feeds into what you were just saying about word of mouth, right? It's so much easier to speak to someone in person and make your case rather than making a cold email, right? And it tends to be more effective to be in person and making your case for your organization. And you obviously get connected to people who can connect you to further people. So that's a pretty cool thing to definitely prioritize. It also increases visibility for organization, which is a different benefit altogether. There's some empirical evidence as well that people who donate to environmental charities may be more willing to support animal welfare, especially farm animal advocacy. And the same can be said about vegans as well, which intuitively makes sense. It's not clear how widely these findings generalize, but there are something to consider. And crucially, most funding is obtained by stewarding recurring donors rather than by identifying new donors. This is an empirical fact across many, many charities. So this will feed into what we discussed tomorrow as well about donor stewardship cycle. But it's something to keep in mind that most funding in terms of what you get from donors is when you steward them and you convince them to donate more rather than identifying new donors. I'll just go over a summary of what we discussed so far, which is the overall decision-making criteria in terms of how to pursue an opportunity. So the first thing that we think of is how costly is going to be to apply for a given opportunity. Is the application form short? Have we completed similar applications recently? And do we have time and labor to use on the application, right? That's the first element that we're thinking about. The second element is what is the benefit or the expected value of applying for a given opportunity? And there's two areas to this, right? The first is what's the amount of money at stake? And are you funding constrained at the moment? How much will securing this grant lessen your constraint? And the second is, even if there's a lot of money on the line or not a lot of money on the line, what's the probability of getting that grant? Are you aligned with their scope? Have they previously funded organizations like yours? Do you have a proof of concept? Have you been recommended to that particular grant, right? So these areas will help you calculate what the benefit is, essentially multiplying the probability with the monetary value. And lastly, of course, does the benefit outweigh the cost and by how much? So if you're assessing between 2 or 3 different funding opportunities, what we would perhaps recommend you do is run through this framework. You don't necessarily have to quantify everything, although it's good if you do. You can do it mentally as well. It'd be really cool, and I think it could lead to some good decisions. So that's all on learning objective number 1. Do we maybe want to break out into breakout rooms now, Jenna, for exercise for everyone? Hope that went well. Can everyone see my? It's loading right now.
I can see it.
Perfect.
Yes, I can.
Perfect. I hope that exercise went well. I hope everyone learned something about deciding which opportunities to pursue, because it is a difficult concept to grapple with when there's so many different opportunities that you could be pursuing. but I hope that this helps in the future. So with that, it's time that we move on to our second learning objective, which is writing good grant applications. So I'll just throw this out to everyone really quick. Have you applied for grants before? How's that been? Have you struggled with any of them? What challenges have you faced? Just throwing it out. Any comments that you've got about grant applications so far?
I can comment. I mean, I think sometimes it can be quite laborious to fill out, these lengthy forms, and can take away from, your main programming as well. So it's definitely useful to, have these kind of like base answers that you have ready for various different applications, as opposed to each time having to fill out the full form. But I definitely noticed that it can definitely be a time and energy suck when you're filling out these grant applications, when really you want to be focused on the main programming and work you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And I fully agree with you about how it's very useful to have the base level answer that you got ready, which you can then tailor to each individual application based on their particular scope. But at least you always have something to work on pre-made, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Is that for me?
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point, and an opportunity for people in other places in the world to be involved. I think about the way that now I used to live in Tanzania. I could work on the ground with animals, but now I'm in the US and I really miss that. So I think there are people all over the world who want to be involved, but we're not on the ground. So how can organizations on the ground utilize folks, and especially a lot of older people who are very interested in writing and contributing, but they're not maybe physically able to be on the ground or even working hands-on. But anyway, so using that as an opportunity to engage more people. Can you have someone elsewhere specifically designated to help with funding and grants?
Yeah, I think that's very doable, especially because quite a bit of fundraising can be done remotely, especially in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic when everything becomes so digitized. And generally, we think that farm animal welfare work in particular is very conducive to things like grants, rather than say something like raising money through events, right? And grants, of course, can be done virtually. So yeah. Just moving on to the substance of the presentation. The thing that we'd like to preface everything with is that different grant makers have different preferences. They're looking at different things in the fit and scope, but also in terms of how they prefer applications, right? Some prefer a really empirical approach that's data driven, whereas others may not really care about that. Some are okay with you not proofreading your application, having some typos, but for others that might be a deal breaker, right? So it's really important to keep that in mind. And the best practice is to follow what the grant maker indicates their preferences to be. But in our experience, effective altruism funders that are very, very likely to fund farm animal advocacy work are looking at three main areas, which we explore in this section. But again, a preface that these might differ if you are applying more from non-EA funders or people who are not as data-driven or empirical focused. Despite that, though, these three areas that we're going to talk about really quick are very crucial in making your organization and guiding your organization's impact, irrespective of what funder preferences are. So even if you're not going to be applying for EA funding, we highly suggest that you do focus on making sure that these three areas that we talk about really quick are, very strong and robust. The first of these is a theory of change. So grant makers are really looking to understand, how is it that your intervention is going to make impact, right? and what assumptions are you making that your intervention will in fact deliver impact. And you can show this through a good theory of change. And there are a few basic traits that a good theory of change should exhibit. It should have a full and clear causal chain. So like, if you're doing this, how will it lead to this? How will it lead to this? How will it lead to this? Right? Very clear, with the causality very clearly illustrated. Secondly, it's specific and it's skeptical. So in going from A to B, what assumption are you making that facilitates transition from A to B, right? So you highlight all the assumptions. Thirdly, it allows you to communicate exactly what you're going to do and the impact that you're aiming to make. And lastly, it will highlight evidence, empirical or otherwise, that your intervention will be successful. So here's a quick format of what a theory of change looks like. Obviously, this is not how it'll go into your grant application, but this is how you build it out yourself, and then transpose it out to your grant application. So there's a few different things going on over here, but it's really not as complicated as it looks. So there's 4 boxes and there's arrows as well, right? So let's talk about the boxes really quick. There's the activities, okay, because what exactly are you even going to do, right? And how are you going to measure what you're doing? Then there's the outputs, which is, okay, you've done an activity. What's going to happen after you do that activity? What will be production? What will be produced? What's the output? What's the output going to be? And how are you going to measure those? Then the outcomes. So your outputs lead to the outcomes, right? And what will those be? And again, how will you measure them? And then lastly, the impact. So what will the overall impact be? And again, how will you measure that? But the other thing too is that the theory of change is as much about these boxes as it is about the arrows. The arrows show you what the assumptions are going to be that will lead from one to another. So you need to understand these assumptions and these risks. I'll show you really quick an example of a theory of change on an intervention that a lot of you I know are doing, like humane education, right? You can see what the activities are and in what order they're going in. You're recruiting and training ambassadors, you're identifying schools, you're developing presentations, and then the presentations are presented. The output is that students attend those presentations, and the outcomes are students are more compassionate, students are more aware, and therefore they buy less animal products and they produce animal production products, and hence the impact is that less animals suffer. But one thing missing in this theory of change is that it doesn't show us exactly what those assumptions are. And I'll ask any of you, what do you think are the key assumptions being made here that if they weren't true, this theory of change won't hold up? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it looks like the first assumption I could see we're making here is that the students are going to be more compassionate towards animals after they've been to a presentation.
Yeah, that feeds into how does learning more, does having greater knowledge lead to behavioral change, right? That's a crucial assumption. And if that assumption is not met, then this theory really falls apart, doesn't it? The second assumption, one more assumption that's being made, this is an example, is this the best way to prevent animal suffering, or are there other ways? And if this is the best way, then what's the evidence for that? Then, does reduction in consumer demand, assuming that the first assumption that you already mentioned is met, does that even lead to less suffering? And what's the evidence for that, right? So the key point that I'm trying to make is that you're showing how one thing will lead to another, but you also need to show what the assumptions are and why those assumptions should be reasonable, right? In terms of what evidence there is. Yeah, before I go into any questions on theory of change, or does anyone from AAA want to add anything really quick? Okay, cool. The second area that a lot of grant makers are looking at is monitoring and evaluation. So with the theory of change, you've shown them exactly what you're doing, why it will work, and the empirical evidence behind it. Actually, why don't we break out into breakout rooms first and talk about theory of change in your grant applications before we go into M&E. Jenna, can you really quickly set up the breakout rooms? Perfect. Is everyone back?
Yeah, all the breakout rooms have been closed.
Cool. Oh, that was really helpful. And everyone got to, see their grant application on a very practical level, what could be improved, what was good, what was bad in terms of their theory of change. The second element that we were hoping to share more about is monitoring and evaluation, which again is quite a critical component, specifically in data-driven EA grant makers, but also it's really good for your organization in general as well. So grant makers in M&E are generally looking to explore two main things, at least. The first is, how will they know if your project is going to be a success or if it's a failure, and can they trust you with funding in the future? And number two, have you taken steps to be data-driven and following evidence instead of just your intuition? And this is particularly relevant for EA opportunities, right? There's a few different steps involved in monitoring and evaluation. The first is identifying the problem, the solution, and your overall goal. The second is defining your indicators, then your baseline, your targets, and the data collection methods and timeline. And then lastly, planning how your data may be used to inform subsequent strategy. So let's break this down one by one, starting with the problem, solution, overall goal. So this is actually really cool and shows how everything kind of links together, is that you probably should have already identified the problem and the solution and your goals and your theory of change, right? This probably should have already been done by you. So for example, going back to this one, what do you all think is the problem, the solution, and the goal here and this theory of change about humane education? Yeah, so I guess the problem is that the animals are suffering, right? The solution is humane education, and the goals are that students buy less animal products and support animal protection projects so that less animals do indeed suffer, right? So again, theory of change very clearly outlines what the problem is, what the solution, what the goals are. So that's number one. Step number two would be defining your indicators in M&E. And what indicators essentially are is the evidence that will help establish whether your project has done what it has planned to do, or how far has the desired changes actually taken place. And these are normally, reported in terms of numbers, statistics, graphs, tables. The crucial element, and this will become a recurring theme as we go through M&E, is that you really don't need to reinvent the wheel here when deciding which indicators to use. Many interventions in farm animal work, or even animal work more broadly, have already been done in other countries, and it's fine to just use pre-existing evidence-based indicators based on interventions that have already been done, right? So you don't need to come up with your own indicators. If you're doing, for example, humane education in a given African country, you can just check what a different organization has done and what indicators they use, and whether that organization is credible, whether the indicators seem reasonably data-driven. So yeah, this is, again, just following industry standard. And I'll just quickly ask anyone if anyone have any thoughts on what the indicators would be in this particular theory of change that we've been looking at in humane education.
Could it be something like how many students attend the presentation?
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of indicators that you can use in different steps of the theory of change, right? How many ambassadors did you get? How many students attended? What's the evidence of self-reported compassion? How many more for example, vegan cafeteria meals are being consumed than previously, and as a result, the percent change in number of animals farmed. So these indicators are fine, but there is a slight problem, which is that they don't necessarily include the risks and assumptions. For example, it doesn't include the assumption that reduction in consumer demand will lead to less suffering, right? Or that knowledge plus attitude change leads to behavioral change. So for that, there might be some benefit of using more complex indicators, which are these, which may mitigate those problems to some degree. You know, you're talking about how well are we implementing our activity, how many students are we reaching, how our student behavior is actually changing, and how much of that can be attributed to us, right? And again, what I'd like to reiterate is that you don't need to come up with these yourself. You can just look at people who have done your intervention already and base it off of them. The third step in M&E would be defining your baseline. But before I get to that, are there any questions so far on, you know, indicators, M&E so far? All right, cool. Defining your baseline. So the indicators will show you to what degree change has happened. But what the baseline will show you is what was the original situation, right? And that'll help you understand the changes that your project or your intervention has indeed brought about. And it'll often be dictated by what intervention it really is, right? But again, there's literally no need to reinvent the wheel. You can just look at organizations that have already been done and the methodologies that they've used in creating a baseline. Or if you have to, you can create your own baseline based on any literature or any data that's available for your country in particular. So again, going back to the DOC that we've been looking at so far, would any of you have any thoughts on what the baseline could be and how exactly do you think you'd identify that? So there's quite a few areas in which you can get a baseline in terms of what the situation currently is. So for example, how many students are currently compassionate towards animals? Then after you've done your intervention, if you check that again, how many students are now compassionate towards animals, you can have an idea of how much attitude change that can be attributed to you. There's quite a few listed, but you know, you get the gist of it. And again, these can also be identified by surveys, academic data, or any different strategies that have been used specific to your intervention by other organizations that have also done it. The fourth step in M&E is defining your targets. So you've identified your baseline, you've identified your indicators. To what degree do you have to get your indicators in order to mark your intervention as either a success or as a failure? And again, ideally, you should base this off of benchmarks that are already existing, right? For example, either through academic literature, or if your intervention has been rigorously tested, or the success rate of other similar organizations and interventions. Because a lot of interventions that you are leading have already been done in different contexts. So you can look at, if, for example, you're doing human education, if an organization did it in, say, a different country, what was the success rate there? How much did they increase compassion towards animals or whatever indicator you're using? And should that be our goal? Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Do you have any recommendations of sources for some of this academic data?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to my mind is a lot of organizations that do these interventions run analyses themselves in terms of assessing their impact. So that could be one. You could also just do a search on Google Scholar or Elicit So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. But I don't know if anyone else from AAA has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, just gonna add that depending on the intervention that you're doing and how niche it is, there's probably not a lot of academic data around specifically animal welfare intervention. However, if you're doing things like kind of humane education and social behavioral change, there's probably enough-ish academic data on like what is the target you actually need to hit to say like, oh yeah, okay, these people have changed their behaviors, changed their minds, they changed their plans to do X, Y, Z. So for those, so it probably depends on the intervention that you're doing. If you're doing specifically like very niche, direct animal welfare intervention, like, I don't know, say you're helping fish, there's not a lot of data on that. But if it comes to more like humane education, there probably is. But yeah, in terms of where you can find it, I'd probably go to what Simon was saying in terms of just like looking at the general kind of academic spaces. There's this website called illicit.org. I think, Sarmat, you've used it before. You basically, I don't know, maybe you can describe it better.
Basically, you input your research question onto it, and it gives you a list of research papers that answer that. And it's way better than Google Scholar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in terms of specifically kind of like monitoring, evaluation, and learning tools or resources for that, I think, Sarmat, you might have a few links to it, but otherwise, yeah, I can also send across like a few more specific links to that as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of M&E guidance on the web specific to what intervention you're doing. For example, if you're doing advocacy or if you're doing education, that's just meant as, an introductory, broad introduction to it. Yeah, cool. So the fifth element in monitoring and evaluation is your data collection methods and timeline, which is self-explanatory. When will data be collected and how? What data collection methods will minimize biases? So for example, if you're collecting compassion and self-reported claims, there could be a lot of social desirability bias involved there, right? In the sense that people will report that their compassion has increased because they want the intervention to continue, or because they want to be perceived as compassionate. And different collection methods can minimize biases like that. And again, we recommend following industry standards because, again, there's a lot of different organizations have done research on this, and you could find quite a bit of data on what data collection method is best for a specific intervention. Again, we'll share a lot of research on that specific to your intervention if you just let us know later on. And lastly, M&E. The last step in M&E is planning exactly how your data will be used in subsequent strategy. So if your targets are met, will you scale up your intervention? If your targets are met, to what degree can you attribute them to your intervention? And if your targets are not met, will you conduct a different intervention or will you try again, right? So these are things that you can come up with as you go along the process, but ideally you should have a set goal and a set plan on what will happen if you reach that goal or if you don't reach that goal. So I'll just really quick go over the best practices when it comes to M&E, which is that it's really important, okay? Regardless of whether you're applying for funding or not, it's really important because how else will you know if you're actually making the impact that you want to be making? And even when you're not applying for a grant, every project or intervention or organization should develop an internal M&E system regardless. It'll show you if you're actually making any positive difference and will therefore guide your strategy. And a really good example of this is by one of the leading animal charities, which is the Humane League. It used some really good M&E to learn the strategy of doing controversial publicity stunts was not really very effective, and they replaced it with corporate campaigns. And to some degree, this allowed them to be able to convince this major corporation called Unilever to stop killing male chicks, potentially saving millions of chicks from really gruesome deaths, right? So I think it's fair to say, had they not been doing really, really good M&E, this might not necessarily have happened. And of course, practically having a strong, consistent internal M&E will also make it really easy for you to make a strong case in grant applications as a data-driven, impact-oriented organization. So yeah, that's all on M&E for now. We'll share more research with you later, but it'd be cool if we could go over the grant applications again specific to M&E and evaluate how your M&E has been done in that grant application specifically. So Jenna, do you want to make breakout rooms if no one from AAA had anything to add? I hope everyone got to get some pretty useful feedback on M&E. We just go to the third element in a good grant applications and a good grant application, which is track record, which is the simplest of the three that we discussed so far. So grant makers really want to know why they can trust you and you specifically to conduct the intervention that you're doing, right? The theory of claim that we've talked about illustrates why your intervention, and your track record will illustrate why you specifically, right? And there's a few best practices here. The first is that statistics and quantification is key. Just quantify everything that you can quantify, so they have a specific idea of exactly what you have done or what you, on what you have done. Media coverage. Have you been covered by the media recently, whether it be locally or internationally? It's pretty cool. It demonstrates that your organization has been credible and has been checked by third parties before. Have you been funded previously from trusted grant makers? So have you received funding from someone that they trust as well? Because if someone else trusts you, that gives them reason to trust you as well. Have you partnered up with trusted organizations or references within the African animal advocacy space or more broadly? So for example, are you working with, say, the Open Wing Alliance, or have you been connected to certain effective altruism groups? And absent those, you can talk about your organizational leadership achievements. So if you're a new organization and you don't have this track record, what is unique to your organization's leadership? Are you perhaps doctors? Have you gotten significant expertise in animal advocacy? Or if not in animal advocacy, have you done other things that demonstrate that you could be really good leaders that could bring out a lot of impact in the future? And of course, you want to prioritize achievements that are most relevant to the grant scope, right? So if it's a data-driven grant maker, you want to prioritize impact. Whereas if it's a grant maker that's focused on different things, then you focus on those. And we've got an example from a recent grant application that we did at AAA. So this is a bad version, the one that we didn't submit, but it could have been something like, we previously helped organizations secure funding from outside sources, and we helped organizations attend conferences abroad. So what do you guys think is the problem over here, or where this could be improved a bit?
Is it that there's no metrics, like how many organizations or how much funding or how many conferences? Like there's no way of knowing the number?
Yeah, exactly. Like the grant maker won't know, has it been 2 organizations that you've helped, or has it been 10, right? And that could make a massive difference. And if you haven't quantified them, they will probably assume the worst, that, okay, they probably haven't helped that many organizations, that's why they haven't referenced them. So even if it's not a lot of organizations, you should still mention that explicitly, because it shows that you can be trusted to provide accurate information, right? A better version would be something like this, which is what we did indeed end up submitting. So have 17 partner organizations raise a total of $85,000, 40.5 of which consisted of grants from EA funders, suggesting that orgs in Africa are becoming more EA aligned. And then a short paragraph about the organization that we influenced to attend certain conferences. There's a few elements over here. First is, of course, that's been quantified, right? Which adds quite a bit to the track record. So they have know exactly how many organizations we've been working with, how much funding they've raised, and how many organizations attended these conferences. One more thing that might be notable that we talk about a bit more in the future is that you know that we've shortened organizations to orgs, right? Some grant makers might not like that, but this particular grant maker that we were applying to had explicitly said that we don't care too much about proofreading or stuff like that, just focus on substance, which is why we were able to do this. But if you're not applying for a grant maker that's explicitly said that, maybe don't shorten it. Don't shorten words like that, right? Yeah, so that's all that we've got on track record. Is there any questions on that? Cool. Jenna, do you want to break us out into breakout sessions again, and we can go over one of our grant applications as track records? Cool. Yeah, track record I think is one of the simpler elements in all that we've discussed so far, in the sense that you just want to make sure we focus on the fundamentals, and it's more of a checklist than anything else. Yeah, okay, is my screen visible, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So one more element that comes into grant applications is acknowledging limitations. And that's whether it comes to theory of change, track record, or M&E. They want to know your limitations. They want to know that you've considered them and why they should trust you regardless. So for example, in theory of change, you should acknowledge if there is limited evidence that your intervention will succeed, but highlight the large benefit that if it does succeed, right? Again, appealing to their expected value calculation as well. In track record, if you don't have a track record of, for example, succeeding in farm animal advocacy, then share other aspects of your track record. For example, your qualifications as organizational leadership, right? In M&E, you don't want to overcommit because M&E is difficult and is difficult. So you want to have measurable objectives, but you should ideally be using the Goldilocks framework so that not too much as to waste resources and time, but not so little that you have no data at all to understand what you're doing and whether it's doing any good. And here's an example from one of our recent applications is that we shared, quite frankly, where we weren't as good as what we could have been doing, right? That we were not as proactive in obtaining honest and effective feedback, and then the consequences of that, and then what we're doing to, overcome those limitations. Before I go on to the final things not to be considered in grant application, does anyone from AAA have anything to add on limitations?
I guess,
Yeah.
just like Salman's saying, I think with the M&E and this whole thing, you really don't want to overdo it, especially if you're early stage. These sorts of things can eat up a lot of time, and you want to basically prioritize, what's going to be most important, what's going to give you the information you need to really push your intervention forward. So I would just say prioritization in all these things, the M&E, the fundraising, theory of change, just make sure you get the key elements, make sure you measure your most important primary metrics, just to reiterate that.
Yeah, it is a lot about prioritization.
I guess another thing I want to add as well, I think I mentioned this briefly in my breakout room, but I think it's probably useful for me to just say in general as well, is I think it's really easy when we are talking about, especially when we're fundraising, to kind of inflate, our achievements or our numbers or whatever. But I think it's probably really important to be really upfront about and honest about what you have done and what you can do, what you can't do, where your weaknesses are. I think funders probably appreciate where you're actually being really honest about your limitations. And I just think it's generally a good thing to do as well.
Yeah, and also practically, I feel like they review hundreds of applications every year. They probably have an idea of when someone is being very, very honest about the limitation versus when they're making stuff up as they go. Yeah, so that's on limitations. just a few other things to be considering, which is proofreading. Use online tools such as Grammarly, and ideally try to have multiple team members with the application if it's a very important application. Again, this depends on the ground maker's scope, right? Some, and their own preferences. Some don't really care about a proofread, they're okay with the occasional typo. But to others, that's an indication that you haven't dedicated a lot of effort into this, but you're not very professional. So you really want to make sure that simple mistakes don't break your application. Don't contradict yourself. There's something that we've noticed is a bit common in budget, that you say something at one section, but then in a different section you might be changing your budget, or the numbers aren't adding up. So again, if you're having multiple team members review an application, that should mitigate that to some degree. Character limits. This is a very common problem as well, especially if you're doing a grant application on Word, or on Google Docs, which is what we do and what all of our organizations do. We tend to just go on and on and on. But then when you copy paste that onto the grant application, you'll find that it just gets cut off, or you've gone over the character limit, and then you have to rework it entirely, which could cost a lot of time. So just watch out for them as you're going through the application form initially. Yeah. So with that, we'll just go on to the final grant application checklist. Okay. So have you answered all the required questions? Do you have a good theory of change? Have you clearly outlined how your intervention will lead to a given objective? Have you highlighted evidence that will work? Then monitoring and evaluation. Have you defined sensible indicators, baseline targets, data collection methods, and timelines? And have you shown how the data might be used to inform subsequent strategy? And have you adequately shown your track record in terms of quantification of your achievements? Have you included as many as possible of media coverage, previous funding, previous partnerships, and your organizational leadership achievements? And then lastly, have you proofread your application, and are you within character limits? So we'll share this checklist with you. Again, it could vary from ground maker to ground maker because some don't care as much about M&E, but it should be a good rule of thumb, especially for EA funders. Yes, Jenna?
Sorry, there's just a question in the chat that I wasn't sure if you saw, but Alpha is asking, what should be done for new organizations to be trusted by funders if the leaders have no experience and achievements?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Cameron replied to that as well. Cam, do you want to say what you said in chat verbally first?
Yeah. I think I was saying this in my breakout room as well. Unfortunately, some of the reality for fundraising is kind of knowing people and being on the funders circles, these sort of groups that talk about different organizations, and just being well regarded in these circles is quite important. So I think going to the conferences and networking and meeting these people in person, like just building some rapport, I think that has to be in combination with a very strong program track record and all these various pieces of documentation we've talked about. So the M&E, a program track record, your theory of change, you kind of need to have that to back you up, and then you take that to these funders and try and meet them in person and build up a rapport. Like I said, I do want to get as many people in the international scene as possible, so that's something we're working on behind the scenes. But yeah, getting in front of these people, having a strong program track record, I think that is where I would focus. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think another thing I would add is if you don't have the kind of experience, or you might not have like enough knowledge in the area they're working on, can you get other team members who have that knowledge and that experience? Because then you can add them as the people that will be helping you, and then include that in your application. I think another thing as well, again, like kind of forgetting just like grant applications for a second and like just thinking about intervention. If you actually don't really have a lot of knowledge or don't have a lot of experience or skills in the specific intervention that you're trying to do, then it's now a good time for you to be doing it. Maybe you would want to set aside like a few months to go and gain that experience somewhere, and then think about doing it, I don't know, 6 months down the line, because you want to make sure you're actually equipped to do the thing that you're planning to do, right? So yeah, just 2 additional thoughts there.
Sorry, just to add in also, I don't know if it is relevant or helpful, but maybe also looking at some of the mentor-mentee programs as well, to try and kind of, not in the realm of interning, but just having that kind of guidance from a mentor as well.
Yeah, especially because that mentor could potentially connect you and recommend you, even if you don't have a formal track record. If they're impressed by you and they think that you have the skills necessary, or that you could develop them over time, then they could recommend you to promising funders. Yeah, and Cameron shared a useful link for that, which is like a list of potential mentorship and training opportunities. I noticed another question in the chat, which is about, could you please throw more light on the leaders' achievements? And I think you're asking about the organizational leadership's achievements. So what we mean to say there is, suppose your organization is really new, but you as a leader is not as new, right? That you've done other work in different industries that would enable you to be a really good advocate in leading a new organization. For example, have you been, I don't know, working in a corporation and you've developed a lot of skills over there? Or have you been working in the media before, so you have really good persuasion skills, which would uniquely enable you to be good at, say, something like lobbying. So it doesn't exactly always have to be related to animal advocacy, although that would be beneficial. But it could also be related to, soft skills that you've developed over the years that you can show in different ways. Yeah. Are there any other questions on the grant applications so far? Or really anything that we've discussed in the workshop today? Yeah, cool. So post-workshop checklist. We recommend that you take the following 4 steps in order to, make the most out of the workshop today. Which is that you build a fundraising tracker and you share it with us, and we'll share this template with you, which is what we use. So it'll keep you updated with what funding opportunities you're applying for right now, what are coming up, and then you can, because most grant applications are yearly, you can reuse it every single year as well, right? So it could be very useful. Next, tell us what opportunities you're planning on applying for and why. And we'll give feedback both on whether we think it's worth applying, but also on how your decision making got to that point as well, and whether it all makes sense and you should go through with it. Third, if any opportunities are coming up that you're interested in applying for, we'll start working on the grant applications and run it through the grant checklist that we have shared. And feel free always to send your applications to us for review, but ideally try to give us at least 1 to 2 weeks before the deadline, so we have adequate time to review it, and also so that you have adequate time to make any changes that we suggest. Yeah, does anyone from AAA have anything to add, or are there any questions? Yeah, cool. Thank you everyone for listening. So yeah, with that, let's get started. Is my side moving? Everything all good? Perfect. Yes, the learning objectives for today are 2 again. The first is the donor cultivation cycle. I'll run over what exactly that is in a second. And the second is how to pitch or communicate with funders, whether that be in person or through a virtual platform such as this itself. So yeah, let's get cracking on to the first one, the donor cultivation cycle. So what this basically is it's a process of building and maintaining relationships with donors to encourage continued and increased giving. So like I mentioned yesterday, a lot of funding is obtained from recurring funders, right? So this involves encouraging them to donate first and then keep donating repeatedly. So there's usually a few main stages, right? The first is identification, in which you identify potential donors. Then qualification and research, where you research them to learn more about their giving and their preferences so you know how to interact with them. Third, you cultivate relationships with them, involving communication, relationship building activities, and so on. The solicitation stage involves making a specific ask for a donation. And lastly, the stewardship cycle. The stewardship stage involves acknowledging and thanking them for their contributions and consistently engaging them in what you're doing. So that's what the cultivation cycle generally looks like. So let's just get into identifying donors. How do you do that? So I want to first ask any of the organizations here on this call, how do you identify donors and how's that been so far? Any challenges you face, anything that goes well, maybe? So yeah, just feel free to either shout out or input a text into the chat or just raise your hand.
Yeah, I think for us when we started, it was definitely through talking to other organizations and kind of learning about the landscape of donors. And then more over time, I think becomes more about networking and going to events and this sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think the fundamentals of that remain the same even now with AAA, right? So I've listed a few ways in which Animal Advocacy Africa identifies donors, and maybe this will help generate some ideas for the rest of the organization as well. So first, we network at conferences a lot. We've talked yesterday about the importance of warm contacts over something like a cold contact, like an email, right? And we look for people with an expressed interest in earning to give or farmed animal advocacy in Africa, because we think these are the people who might be most likely to donate money. And of course, there are stages in this. If they do not have an interest in farmed animal advocacy in Africa, they might have an interest in farmed animal advocacy in developing countries or farmed animal advocacy more broadly, right? So we network at conferences and look for people who we think might be willing to donate to us. Similarly, we increase our visibility. So to get as many people as possible to know about Animal Advocacy Africa, via of course, engaging at conferences, but also in various forums, on social media, and so on. And then we keep an eye out for people who are interacting with our material very often, because those are people are supporters. And it's very easy. It's relatively easier to convince existing supporters to donate to you than it might be to convince someone new to support you and then donate money, right? And of course, then directly reaching out to people we think might be promising. For example, on LinkedIn, if I see someone who has an interest in farm animal advocacy in Africa, I might consider reaching out to them. And one thing that we're considering right now is in the near future, we're going to identify demographics that are more likely to donate to us through academic research and our own experience. So for example, yesterday I shared some research that people who donate to environmental charities are more likely to be convinced to donate to farm animal advocacy. So we might do some sort of research to identify those demographics specifically and increase our outreach to them specifically. So before I go on to the next stage in the donor cultivation cycle, I'd just like to ask if anyone has any questions or any inputs on how they particularly identify their donors as well, or if there's anything that you do differently. If you think we should be doing things differently, just again, feel free to just say anything you want. Cool. So how do you qualify them as likely to donate? So what the stage involves is doing research into them to find out first what their preferences are in terms of how they want to get reached out to. But second, also, are they likely to donate to you after all? And is it worth cultivating an entire relationship with them because you think that they might donate after all, or is it just not worth it? So does anyone have any thoughts on that to begin with before I go into how Animal Advocacy Africa does it? Cool, no worries. So how do we qualify them as likely to donate? So there's a few things that we look at. We've recently begun creating a database of donors. These are donors that already exist and identifying why they donate to us. So whenever we thank our donors, we also ask them, why is it that you donate to us? And we think this could inform our future expectations of donors, right? So if we notice, for example, that a lot of donors are donating to us because of an interest in a specific area that we're working on, for example, capacity building, then that informs that, okay, next time we're reaching out to donors, maybe we should emphasize that element more than others. But of course, there are limitations here, especially when you're an early stage organization with very few donors. It might be possible for that data to be skewed quite a bit. So in all these areas, there are limitations that we do consider. Then, of course, we research them, their background, what causes they've donated to in the past. There's various sources for this. If they're very prominent public people, then you can Google them. Otherwise, you can look them up on LinkedIn, forums that they're pretty active on. So for us, that's the EA forum that we usually check out to see their history and what they're interested in, and so on. But generally speaking, our qualification tends to happen alongside our identification. So we generally identify people as likely to donate, and then we qualify them on the same stage. So we don't spend too much time on this. Yeah, before I go on to cultivation, does anyone want to pop in about how their organization qualifies, or again, anything that you think maybe we should be doing differently? Cool. Yeah, how do you cultivate relationships? So this is the next stage in the donor stewardship cycle, right? So I guess I'll start with how we cultivate relationships again. So there's quite a few things that go into this, which are regular progress updates. So we make sure that every quarter we send out a newsletter to all our donors, but even to all our supporters and especially our donors, indicating what we've been up to, what our partner organizations have been achieving recently, and what our strategy is looking forward. Alongside that, there's also social media updates. So we make sure that our social media is quite active. Jenna's in charge of that, whether that be on LinkedIn or on Facebook. And of course, for different organizations, you might find that different social media works better. So for us, we found that Facebook and LinkedIn seem to be working the best. So we generally stick to those. But some organization might benefit from more activity on different platforms as well. So maybe that's something for you to consider as well. And then occasionally we send personalized messages to high value donors. So ones that are particularly important, who have donated to us consistently, who donate high amounts of money, and who demonstrate support in other ways, whether that be through feedback and advice or by connecting you to other donors. So we personally text them or email them and just let them know what we're up to, what they're up to. If we're in the same city as them, we offer to meet up. So we do things like that as well. One-to-ones at conferences, again, it's really emphasizing the importance that conferences can sometimes play in this. So if we go to a conference and we see certain people, existing donors or potential donors that we know, we have one-to-ones with them, we share our progress, and we make the case for why they should support farm animal advocacy in Africa. Right. Before I go on to soliciting donations, does anyone want to comment really quick on the cultivation side? Again, anything we're doing wrong or anything that your organization is doing, whether that be similar to us or completely different to us?
I guess I could just add a note that, you know, a lot of our donations did kind of come through these more one-on-one relationships with maybe high net worth individuals or people who, you know, are doing a lot of the funding work. So I would just encourage, the cultivation of these very high value relationships, and you do have to kind of keep them going and make sure you're updating them through emails and this sort of thing. So a lot of it, at least for us, has come from these more personalized relationships where you're, you know, sending a individual message to one person who might donate a lot of money. You know, that's from our experience, but I do think that that's probably similar for a lot of you guys as well.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think there's considerable empirical evidence as well that most organizations secure funding from a very small pool of donors. And what the larger pool of donors, which are like students who donate $5 or $10 every month or every 2 months, what they do is mostly, you know, does spread the message. But the bulk of your funding generally tends to come from a few very promising donors. So that is something to keep in mind. Yeah, so how do you solicit donations? This is, again, another step in the donor stewardship cycle. Again, I guess I'll talk about how we do it first, and then maybe open it up to any other organization that want to pitch in. Yeah, I see a hand raised. Daniel, you wanna go ahead?
I think you're muted, Daniel.
Hi. I have a question.
I think your voice is breaking, but I just noticed that you sent a message in the chat. Is that the question that you asked? Yeah, so I guess I'll answer this question on the chat first, and then if there's something else you also want to ask, it'd be great if you just input that into the chat, because the voice is breaking a bit. How do you cultivate this relationship with funders such as AAA or EA funds? So I guess when it comes to grant makers, it's less important, it's my intuition, because there it's a lot about your application and your case. Especially with EA funds, they're more concerned with the gravity of your application. That being said, if you do want to cultivate relationships with EA funds, if you go to their website, they made it clear who the grant makers are, who decides whether or not you get funded. So you could always reach out to them for advice to learn more, and to better understand their preferences in terms of who they fund and why they fund them. One more thing that I'd add is if you go to any conferences, they're usually there are people from EA funds and other prominent grant making organizations. So you can always ask to have a one-on-one with them. Sometimes they even set up workshops where they tell you how to write a really good EA funds application. But a one-on-one with them is great because it puts you on their radar, and you can take specific advice from them on how to tailor your application. But I don't know if anyone else from AAA has anything to add on that.
Yeah, I'd probably just add that I think I'd agree that the relationship with these kinds of like foundations are probably different, given that they are foundations as opposed to like individual donors. And then also your relationship with them will probably also depend on their own preferences of like, you know, some funders have reporting processes at specific intervals. and where you're going to be like telling them about what you've done and the progress you've made based on the funds that you've given them. But outside of that, you can always just also like reach out to the people that were in charge of giving you the funding, right? And to ask like questions or to get feedback on things like that. So I think, yeah, the relationship there is probably a bit different, but you can always still like reach out to us for help.
Yeah. I hope that answered your question. If there was anything else that I missed. Okay, cool. You just text on the chat. Cool. Okay. Let's move on. How do we solicit donations? Oops. Yeah, so as you can tell, the first few stages involves a lot of research, developing relationships. After we've done that, leveraging all that we know about them, we send them and ask, prioritizing what we know appeals to them. So if we know that they're
Yes.
yeah, is that a question? Okay, there's nothing in the chat, so I guess not. Yeah, so we send and ask prioritizing what we know for a fact appeals to them. So if we know they're data driven or they have certain preferences in certain areas, our ask is tailored to that. And we try to use as much empirical research as there is in terms of generating that ask while we're reaching out to them. So what we tend to do is we draft a generic message, maybe using ChatGPT, and then we personalize it. And actually, I think it might be helpful if I really quickly share how ChatGPT works. So I'll just do that in a second. Yeah, is it appearing on the screen now?
Yeah.
Very cool. So basically what ChatGPT is, it's this new artificial intelligence algorithm that's been released by OpenAI. And it's really stunning all that it can do. It can make things so much easier for organizations, especially new ones. So you go to this link, chat.openai.com, and you sign up for an account. It's free, so that's not an issue. And then supposing I want to write an email to a certain donor, asking them to donate to Animal Advocacy Africa, I would write something like, I lead an organization called Animal Advocacy Africa, which aims to build the farmed animal movement in Africa. Write an email to a prospective donor about this, right? To begin with, this might be the prompt that I first send, just to gauge what ChatGPT might reply with to a potential donor asking. And then based on what you said, they might, ChatGPT would generate an entire email on this. So let's wait for it to generate. So yeah, you can see that it's talking a bit about things that we don't necessarily do here, right? Running campaigns and raising awareness about the issues facing farm animals in Africa. That's not really what AAA necessarily does, but that's because this prompt wasn't that detailed. So suppose now I ask, now I mentioned that Animal Advocacy Africa does three main things: research, capacity building, and regranting. Can you update the email focusing on these? Yeah, so now it's generating a new email, taking into account these. And my point is that you can specify this as much as possible to add as much detail as possible. You could even because like I only mentioned research, right? So it's assuming what research I'm referring to. But if I was specific in what I mentioned by research, for example, if I said the research into the landscape of farm animal advocacy in Africa, it would have mentioned that. If I suggested that write an email to a donor who is 35 years old, is a male, lives in the United States of America, has a history of donating to animal advocacy organizations, then ChatGPT would include that as well. Good practice is to be as specific as possible. You could, and another good practice is just spend a lot of time like just chatting to it, because then it learns more about you, but it will forget it if you like close it. But so these are all the conversations I've had with it in the past. So if I just went into one of them, it would have information from there already. So yeah, I see some things in the chat. Yeah, yeah, it's really cool. Yeah, before I go on, does anyone from AAA want to add anything about ChatGPT and how you guys use it?
I guess I'll just say that it's definitely worth, using and trying, and it's probably gonna level up your communications game and fundraising and writing emails, copy, all this sort of thing. So definitely have a play around with it. I think it takes some time to like learn how it works and learn the prompts, but worth investing some time, because it's probably going to save you more time. It's going to enable you to level up your fundraising. So I would just encourage people to have a play with it.
Also, just as a kind of disclaimer in a way, is to make sure that you proofread everything, because it doesn't always word things in the correct way and sometimes makes up facts that aren't necessarily true. So just always do a kind of like proofread over it, and don't just like copy paste automatically after the first try.
Yeah, we use ChatGPT, as I mentioned, to draft a very generic message, and then you have to personalize it in order to tailor it to particular donors that you're reaching out to. One other thing about ChatGPT is it's not just for writing emails. You could use it in a variety of ways that we could probably dedicate an entire workshop to. But it's worth looking into, and we'll definitely share some guidelines as well on how you can use it, the limitations of it, because there are quite a few, and other best practices alongside it. If anyone else from AAA has anything else to add, otherwise I'll move on. And if there's any questions on ChatGPT at all, I'll just check the chat as well. Okay, cool. Yeah, so again, a lot of donors have different preferences. Some prefer to be told precisely what your funding gap is, and others, of course, tend to prefer to be asked more indirectly. And you gauge these in qualification, and there are no hard rules in this, because every donor can be different. In our personal experience, we've noticed that, and that of other animal advocates in the effective altruism movement specifically, international funders who are EA tend to prefer to be asked directly, being told exactly what your funding gap is and what you need the money for. But this could be different when it comes to people outside the EA network or people who haven't donated for animal advocacy before. Yeah, does anyone have any questions really quick on soliciting donations? Again, maybe how you do it, or how maybe we could change our approach as well. Cool. Right, so the last stage is stewarding existing donors. So again, I'll just talk about how we do this really quickly, and then we'll go from there. So personalized thank you messages. Again, you could use ChatGPT here as well, but we do recommend personalizing them quite a bit, because different donors have different reasons for donating, and it's good if your thank you message incorporates that as well. And if we haven't done this yet, which we ideally would have wanted to have done in qualification, we ask them what communication methods work for them. So some tend to want to communicate frequently, so they get a lot of newsletters, whereas others tend to prefer direct emails very, less often. So in our system, then usually asks about this when we thank them. And I would emphasize the importance of thanking donors because, like we've said, a lot of donations are secured by stewarding existing donors more than anything else. So thanking them and making them feel valued for what they've donated for having donated to you is really key in terms of getting them to donate again. And after we've done these 2 steps, we create reminders on which team members should reach out when to which donor. So different team members are responsible for different donors with whom they have personal relationships. So we create reminders for them on when they should reach out to who exactly. And then stewardship from then on looks very similar to our cultivation element in the sense that we touch base with them to ask for advice or help. And of course, we keep sending them updates on what we're up to, what our partner organizations are up to, and so on. And one thing that we did consider was a top donor page. So a page in which we highlight all the top donors that donate to us, but this was not suitable for us because we've got a very small donor base. So we decided that the effort that would be spent making that page would not be worth it. But of course, this could vary for different organizations. And for you, it might be possible that creating a top donor page might be really helpful in terms of increasing the visibility of your donors. Yeah, so does anyone have any comments on stewarding existing donors, whether that be from any of the organizations here or anyone from AAA? Cool. So what I'll do is I'll just run through the checklist that we've made for donor stewardship, and then we'll go into breakout rooms for an exercise that should apply this into practice, what it would look like. So here's a useful checklist, which is number 1, are you identifying new donors using any research available or your own anecdotal experience with useful demographics? And of course, by attending conferences and connecting with potential funders. Number 2, are you appropriately qualifying potential donors by doing research on them and their preferences? And number 3, are you cultivating relationships appropriately by sharing progress updates, meeting them one-to-one, and sharing personalized messages with them? 4th, are you making the ask, so the solicitation element, appropriately, having researched them appropriately, and tailoring the ask to what they want and their preferences as much as possible? Next, are you stewarding them appropriately by thanking them, by updating them with your work at an elevated priority than, for example, regular supporters? And lastly, are you optimizing these processes as much as possible by using technology, for example, ChatGPT, but that's just one example of many ways you can do this, and by setting reminders on reconnecting with donors? So yeah, that's all that we have on the donor cycle. Does anyone have any comments on that, organizations or AAA, before we go into breakout room for an exercise? Right. Yeah, hope everyone had a good break. So moving on to how to pitch, which is how do you communicate with funders, for example, on a call, on a video call like this one, or even in person? So what are the questions some of them ask? What are some of the do's and some of the don'ts? So there's a few do's, things that you should be doing. The first is be confident and be yourself. That's easy to say, but in all honesty, it does work. If you believe in your mission, if you believe in the mission that your organization is doing, if you believe in the work that your organization is doing, it really shines through and it really makes you likable as well when you're talking to someone. Secondly, you want to prepare in advance for questions that they might ask. We'll ask you a few questions in the next breakout room, so that'll be some good practice. Number 3, you want to pause for questions from them. So as you're talking to them, you don't want to be going on and on and on, right? You also want to give them an option to ask any clarifying questions about what you're doing. So that's pretty important. 4, you want to set up the meeting in advance. So you want to reach out to them beforehand. You don't want to just see them in the middle of a crowd, for example, in a conference, and you go up to them with your idea for a project that should be funded. You want to reach out to them beforehand and organize a meeting at a certain place or at a certain time. You want to highlight collective wins. So wins that your organization has achieved, wins that your organization has contributed to in the wider farm animal advocacy movement, right? Number 6, be kind, courteous, and professional. So it's fundamental of conversation of professional conversations. You want to be courteous, you want to mind the time, you want to say your pleases and your thank yous. Number 7, you want to keep track of time. Remember, funders are really busy people. If they say that they're free to meet you for 20 minutes, do try to keep your pitch contained to 20 minutes and do not overextend their time, because they do have other things to be doing, and obviously, of course, so do you. And lastly, you want to follow up with them, whether that be to ask for further advice or to understand where and to understand if they will fund you in the end, right? So don't expect a yes or no over there, but do follow up to get further clarity on what they're thinking. In terms of pitching don'ts, you don't want to be late to the meeting. Of course, it sets a bad first impression. You don't want to sell them. Of course, it's good to be passionate about, your intervention and what you're doing, but you don't want to be like a salesperson trying to persuade them or trying to sell them an idea. You want to honestly lay the facts for them and then leave it up to them as to whether or not they'll fund you. Number 3, you don't want to be aggressive. You want to be polite, courteous at all times. You don't want to be pushing them in any way. And you don't want to be expecting an immediate yes or no. So funders have a lot of opportunities that they're looking at, and they can't be expected to come up with a decision in the 20 minutes that they've spent talking to you. You want to give them a bit more time to think about it, to let the idea sink in their heads before they can confirm to you whether or not they'll be able to fund you. 5, you don't want to badmouth other groups in the farm animal advocacy space or the philanthropy space more broadly. First of all, it's just not the best thing to be doing, but also it sets a bad, it might give the funder a bad impression of you. So rather than bad mouthing other groups, like we said in the dues, you want to focus instead on highlighting collective wins. So honestly, praise other groups and the work that they're doing as well. Number 6, you don't want to avoid questions and be dishonest about your limitations. We alluded to this yesterday as well in the grant applications area, that funders are very often pitched to. So they get an idea of when people are being dishonest or they're avoiding questions. So you don't want to do that. If they ask you a question and you don't have an answer to it, ideally you want to have an answer to it, but if you don't, then it's probably best to share that rather than try to avoid it, because they will inevitably notice. And lastly, you don't want to be responding defensively. So if they suggest that something you're doing isn't maybe the best way to be doing it, you want to share, yes, why you disagree, but you don't want to be, you don't want to, present yourself as being defensive or as having been hurt by their argument. So you don't want to be too defensive. You want to be assertive, yes, but not too defensive. So yeah, those are the pitching don'ts. Before we go on to breakout rooms and we role play some pitching, does anyone from AAA or any of the partner organizations have anything to add? Any pitching do's or don'ts that they have experience with, or anything else that they have to contribute right now?
I guess I could say a comment about personalizing it. You want to think about your audience and like what kind of funder are they, and then tailor your language and how you're talking to them, and how kind of like, I know you said don't be aggressive, but like how aggressive you want to be. Some funders are more cut and dry, some, need more warming up. So I would just say that like really think and use all the, skills that we've just talked about before in the last session, and really think, okay, what kind of funder is this and how can I tailor my pitch to this funder?
Yeah, exactly. Like we've emphasized a lot throughout today and yesterday, different funders have different priorities and you want to focus on them. So some are very data-driven, impact-oriented. Others are not as much. Others are focused on other areas, such as, diversity and inclusion, or the scale of activities that you're doing. So you do always want to tailor your pitch towards your particular audience, whether that be in person or in email. I think it's one of the main takeaways from today should be that personalization is very key in terms of getting donors, but also retaining them over time. Yeah, does anyone else have anything to add on fundamentals of pitching? Cool. So let's break out into breakout rooms. So what we're going to do is we're going to divide us into different rooms and we're going to role play as pitchers. So for example, we'll ask you if you're going to a conference anytime soon, and if you are, if there's any funder that you'll be speaking to. And if you are, we'll role play as those funders and go through how some questions might look. So Jenna, do you want to make those breakout rooms really quick?
Yeah.
So I'm sure some of you were already asked. Okay, cool. I'm sure some of you were. Where are we? Oops. Went a bit ahead. 1 second. Tech complications. Yeah. Okay. Can you see the questions you may be asked slide?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I got a notification that my connection's unstable as well. So if you can't hear me at any point, just raise your hand. Yeah, so some of you might have been asked questions like these. This is a list that's far from comprehensive, but these are questions that funders might be asking you, whether that be in person or on call, in terms of getting to know more about your organization. So a good practice would be to have an answer ready for most, if not all of these. And I guess one thing that I will emphasize is that these questions are obviously very broad and they can be applied to anything. But the key question that funders will often ask will be specific to your organization and what you are doing, so your specific intervention. So be sure that you understand your intervention through and through. You understand what's good about it, what the theory of change is, monitoring and evaluation, and your limitations. So if you know that and you're transparent about that, that'd be really good, I think, in terms of, making funders comfortable in funding you. I don't know if anyone from AAA has anything to add, or if any of the organizations here have any particular questions on these.
I guess a comment is just kind of be prepared for any questions. Like it's going to go off script as well. So even just like we just did in that breakout session, do a practice session with your colleagues or other people and kind of practice the curveball questions as well, because there's no doubt going to be questions you've not thought about and you're going to have to think on the spot. So, just being able to do that as well is useful.
One of the organizations in my group also talked about how they practice pitches, 30 to 60-second pitches with people from their own organization, and they don't stop until they've perfectly refined that pitch. And I think that's a great place to start. And then, of course, after that, you do what Cameron just said. You prepare for questions that you might not even expect. Yeah, anything else from anyone from AAA or any of the organizations here? Cool. Yeah, then we can checklist. So that we covered today. The donors we would like you all to consider doing is build your systems or identifying them, taking the ask on. So think about that. And maybe take 1 hour. Of course, by teaching someone, you yourself will also improve in your understanding, and you'll learn more about where your gaps are in understanding what I've just said. So that's on the donor cultivation cycle. In terms of pitching, of course, you want to be practicing, you want to develop answers to the questions listed above. Like I said, we'll share the slides with you so you have a list of those questions. And of course, in the days and weeks leading up to the conferences or any funders that you'll be talking to, whether they be local or international, reach out to us, and we can do more practice with you, and role play so you have a good grasp of what questions to expect and you'll be more comfortable in the actual conversation. And lastly, then be sure to tell us how those conversations went, if they were successful, if they were not successful. Yeah, so that's all from me. Thank you all for listening. And if anyone from AAA or has anything to add, or if any organization has any questions, any comments, feel free to make them.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, AAA.
Bye.
You guys are wonderful.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.